So over the years, you have become a prominent advocate of a theory called group selection, and there's been a lot of controversy over this over the years. Of course, Richard Dawkins wrote his famous book, The Selfish Gene, which talked about how evolution happens not just at the individual level, at the individual genes level. And there's been a lot of debate about this, and you have gone up against Dawkins and other people of that ilk. But before we get into the theory of group selection, can you sort of paint a picture of how this debate has played out over the last few decades?
Yeah, sure. And I think that it's important I always like to situate things in a historical context, because I do think we're living in historic times, and we really need to understand that we're playing a role in history. And so if you go back to that period, the mid-20th century, what we find is not only in my field of evolution that it was the era of the selfish gene and the selfish individual, but it was also the advent of the rational actor in economic theory, Homo economicus we call it, and in the social sciences, something called methodological individualism. And so at that time, across the board, like a tide that lifts all boats, it was as if we could only understand social phenomenon by understanding them by reducing them to individual action, or even further to gene interactions. Otherwise, we don't understand them. And so this was an age of reductionism, and selfish gene thinking was a part of that. In part because it was easier to do math on it, and so superficially it seemed more scientific, that if you were more systemic and if you were more appreciative of complexity, you could only talk about it in words. You couldn't write equations around it. And so this kind of reductionism had a veneer of science around it.
What was wrong with that theory, though, from your perspective?
Well, let me count the ways. I mean, in the first place, evolution is much, much more about genes. I mean, it's whole organisms that evolve. Genes are parts of whole complex biological systems. In the second place, there's more to evolution than genetic evolution, as we've seen. Darwin knew nothing about genes. He talked about heredity. And so, if anything, if any trait is replicated by any means, that's an evolutionary process. And so that's why we can take this theory and we can apply it to such things as cultural evolution or artificial intelligence. The three ingredients of an evolutionary process are variation, everything tends to vary; selection, those differences make a difference in survival and reproduction; and replication. So any process that includes those three ingredients is an evolutionary process with certain consequences. And genetic evolution is just one of them. And then finally, what's taken place since then is that we've developed tools, thanks to computers, so we actually can model complexity in more than just words. And so now there's a science of complexity, but it didn't really exist before the advent of computers. And so just as I said that reductionism was a tide that lifted or sank all boats, I think now we're entering an age of complexity, as well we should, that is also lifting all boats. And across the board, in all these different topic areas, we are now able to take a more systemic view of the world that appreciates the complexity that's already out there.